Intent is to, in including these presentations of these several topics, is to introduce these concepts to you and help you begin to practice the behaviors that demonstrate each one. Now, we call them leadership behaviors because you are, in your role as a professional caregiver, you are a leader. You are doing leadership kinds of things. At first, you might wonder, well, what's he talking about? I'm not in a leadership role within the organization. Well, that's in terms of perhaps role, but in terms of how we talk about leadership as a relational influence process. That is, you interacting with others in such a way that you're able to move towards the accomplishment of a goal or an outcome. That's doing leadership. And you are working with clientele, and you are working with other people that are involved in the organization, supervisors, co-workers, others. And in doing that, you are engaging, we believe, in leadership. At least that's what we want you to do. And understand that each of these topics that we're talking about here are leadership topics, and they are connected one to another. This is something that I'll be mentioning throughout the series, that there are ideas and concepts from one of these topics that may apply to another topic. It may help you better understand by applying the concept to that other topic. But I want you to think about leadership in terms of it being an influence relationship, a process of interaction. And again, put that as the context as we work through each of these sessions for you as a caregiver, as a professional caregiver. So even though positionally you might not feel you have the title of leader, you do leadership things. You engage in the process of influential leadership. And it's important that you understand that as we get into these various topics. Now, the program, that is these 5 sessions that we'll be doing, are going to draw upon the ideas from a leadership model that I've developed that was recently included in a book that was published by myself and John Stanko entitled The Leadership Carol. And this leader's model has the 7 LEADERS letters indicated, and each letter stands for something having to do with leadership. So here they are. L is for leadership. E is for ethics. A is for alignment. E is for D, is for decision making. The letter D for decision making. The letter E is engagement. R is resilience. And S is stewardship. And as we work through the topics, even though you might not hear each of those words again repeated, you'll know that some of the content that we talk about, the ideas that we're going to present, come from this leadership model. So you'll hear that model referenced throughout the different sessions. Now, today's topic is ethics, a very important one that we think is central, critical to effective leadership. One author in particular, Joanne Chula, who has done a lot of writing about ethics and leadership, says that good leadership is ethical leadership. That's how important she thinks it is. In other words, you can't do leadership well. You can't be a good leader doing good leadership unless it's ethical leadership. That's pretty important. Now, I just mentioned to you the concept of the leader's model. And in each of these that are connected to the leader's model, in this case ethics, I have concepts and principles that we draw upon from each one. And so in this case, the leader's model speaks to ethics in these 3 areas. First of all, ethics is more about finance and process. It's about the treatment of people. So often we think about ethics in terms of somebody cooked the books of that company, as it's called. Somebody did something wrong from a financial standpoint. Somebody manipulated something to make the revenue look better than it actually was, or was skimming money from the top. You hear about all these things in the news, and often that's what people think when they think of ethical leadership or ethical issues within organizations. It's our belief that every day the real ethical issues are about how people are treated. And you, as a caregiver professional, are engaged with people. And so ethics is extremely important to the work that you do every day, to the care that you give to these clients that you work with who need your help and need your care. Second, ethics stems from character and virtue. Part of the ethical equation is, who are you? And so we talk about you. What's inside? Where is your heart? Where is your mind in terms of ethics? And what do you have as in terms of your personal qualities and characteristics? What kind of character and virtue it resides within you that allows you to behave in a certain way and engage in ethical acts, and also be willing to respond to ethical acts that you think are unethical? So that's number two, and that's very important. Ethics stems from character and virtue. And number three, standards and values must be lived, not just discussed, not just talked about. Again, it's this idea that if I am committed to leading ethically, it means I walk that talk. I'm not just giving you a story. I'm not just giving you a line. I'm walking that talk. I'm walking in those ethical principles. I'm demonstrating to you what it means. I want you to know that what I say to you, I'm truly committed to. And today we're talking about commitment to leading ethically. And that's what we want to do. That's what we want to accomplish. Now, our goal in this session is to help you become a better ethical decision maker. Decisions regarding, let me back up just a second. Ethics involves making decisions every day. Generally speaking, we are engaged in what is right and what is wrong. And so it is a decision-making process. And so we want you to become better at making ethical decisions as a result of this session and thinking about the issues that we bring up. That's great. You know, if we think about how we make ethical choices, and if we can be more sensitive to that, if we can understand that better, we think we can become better at making good ethical decisions. And I emphasize this, I'm going to be using the construct of 3 P's, the letter P, as in Paul. 3 P's that we'll be talking about here the rest of the way. Process is number 1. Number 2, P is perspective. And number 3 is the person. Process, perspective, and person. And we're going to be working through what each of those means. First of all, let's talk about process. Now, process in this case refers to the manner in which you make ethical decisions. We'll examine the steps you can take to resolve an ethical dilemma that can help you make better ethical decisions. We want to create in your mind the need for working through, if you can, if you have the time, to working through a process that lays it out, rather than just immediately reacting. That kind of knee-jerk response, which sometimes can be problematic because emotions get in the way, we don't have all the information that we need, we think something's going on, maybe it isn't when we finally get to that point, but we engage and we intervene and we make a decision that we should have, boy, if we'd have had time, if you could have worked through a process, if you could have brought in some other things we're going to be talking about, we think the chances of that decision being even better is there. And so process is very important. It allows you to slow down. It allows you to kind of think rationally through what's going on and through the issues that are taking place. Now think about this for a minute here. Again, we're talking about the process. So what's the first step? What's the first thing that you often do when you encounter a situation where you know you're going to have to do something about it? Well, the first thing is we want to recognize that there is an issue, that there is an ethical dilemma. That is, and we'll get to that later in the presentation in terms of the importance of being able to recognize and be sensitive to that there's maybe something going on here ethically. Now, I just want to stop for a minute and say something that I know you work in a very regulated environment. That is, there are certain legal and procedural issues that you have to pay attention to. This is how we do X. This is how we do Y. And so often there's a temptation to say, well, that's the only thing I need to be concerned about in terms of ethics. They've prescribed what you have to do legally, what our organization says you have to do, and therefore any other obligation for discerning whether something is right or wrong is not an issue. And I'm saying today, yes, it is. This goes beyond the legal, beyond the procedural kinds of structures that are already in place in your organization. These are the things that fall outside of that often, that you're going to have to deal with and that you're going to have to figure out. And so we're talking about how to get better at that. So back to the presentation, you recognize that a problem exists. You want to make sure you know what really is going on. And part of the way in which you do that is you begin that process of step 2, and that is you begin to gather relevant facts. And relevant is important. That refers to concepts or things or behaviors or whatever might have been observed that truly relate to the issue that you think is the problem, is the dilemma, the ethical dilemma. This ethical dilemma that you are beginning to figure out what's going on now needs the facts of what really took place. Who was involved? What happened? What were the behaviors? Gathering those relevant facts. Now again, I know this takes a little bit of time, but if you can find that time, boy, you can avoid a lot of problems later downstream if you have the time to work through the kind of process that I'm describing. So first, again, recognize that it's a problem, then you begin to gather relevant facts, and then thirdly, you begin to consider or think about, what could I do in this situation? You know, maybe there's a couple of alternatives. Maybe there's a couple of choices that I could make to resolve this. One would result in this, one would result in that. You know, it's not always a clear choice of black and white, so to speak, as some would describe. Sometimes it can be a bit gray. And you try to, what are the possible solutions to this dilemma? And so maybe you have one or two possibilities. Now, in that, as you begin to analyze and as you begin to evaluate those possibilities, those alternatives, those choices, you want to consider some other things too. You've already talked about or already considered what are the relevant facts. Now I want you to think about, who's this going to affect? Who are the stakeholders in this situation? By stakeholders, I'm not talking about stockholders. I'm talking about stakeholders. Stakeholders are the people that have something to gain or lose or be impacted by a decision that you make that has ethical implications. So think about that. Think about, in your work, who are the stakeholders? You've got, obviously, the organization itself. Who are the people that you work with? The co-workers, the supervisors, those that direct supervisors and others. The client's family, you know, possibly. Other people of interest. And you need to identify those. And then you need to ask the question, how is this decision going to affect these various stakeholders? How would this decision affect the stakeholders? And if your conclusion is that even though you think your decision may be valid, but the impact it could have could be anything from negative to devastating, you need to rethink that. Maybe you're going to have to talk to some more or interact with others about this to really nail it down in terms of a decision that not only you think is the right thing to do, and maybe others as well, because you can bring others into this process, but one that will have, whose impact will be favorable to those who really have an interest in what's going on, and particularly with the clients that you're working with. So you consider in that step number 4. Now, step 5 is the final official step, so to speak, when you say, answered those questions, I've investigated, now it's time to make the choice and do it. And I emphasize there the idea of doing it. Making a choice, up here, saying mentally, this is what I want to do, that's not a decision. You've made a choice. The decision is implementing that choice. So you have to be able to then address it. You have to deal with it. You have to say, this is what we're going to do. And sometimes that's the toughest part of it. Sometimes not enough time is spent on, now how am I going to implement this decision? How am I going to communicate this? Who do I need to speak to? How do I need to do that? And then you want to follow up. You want to make sure that the decision you made had the outcome that you anticipated. You made a decision to do this. You worked through this process that I'm describing. You feel comfortable that you made the right decision. Others do as well. You follow up 2, 3, 4 weeks down the road. Did it really have the impact that I wanted it to? And if it did, then you're thankful. If it hasn't, then you find out why. And you not only perhaps make a correction, but you also learn from that follow-up. That follow-up is very informative. So that's the process we talk about. Now, perspective is something that's very different. Process is not going to tell you what's right and wrong. It's going to help you get to that point. But perspective is about the values that you hold that guide your decision as to what is, in fact, right and wrong. Now, think about that for a minute. What is your ethical perspective? Could you articulate that? Could you tell somebody, I believe this, 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 and this when it comes to making ethical decisions especially about people? What are they? What would guide and inform the process that you work through? These are the values that go beyond what behaviors are legal and accepted policies of operation in your organization, as I mentioned before. And it's absolutely essential that you know what those values are, what your values are, in order to make quality ethical decisions. You have to understand, what do I stand for? What do I believe? What does the organization believe? What are the core values of the organization? How does that impact what I believe, what I do when it comes to resolving ethical dilemmas? You need to identify those core values that influence your ethical decision making. And I just have a process here that I want to share with you that may help you identify what are the values as you think back through your life that have influenced you. You may also think, well, perhaps I need to rethink my values. Perhaps I need to understand I'm in an organization, I'm doing work that is very human-centered, and I need to understand what do I think in terms of the clients that I'm working with? What values influence what I do, my commitment to their lives and to the mission of the organization? You know, this goes beyond the job. This goes beyond work for, you know, a particular outcome. This is work for something more than just the physical benefits, the tangible benefits of working. I'm talking about, you know, the value of why it is you do the work. And we'll be talking about that in one of the other presentations, as a matter of fact. So what to do? First of all, think about those people in your life who influenced you. What values did they live by? Which ones would you want to live by from that experience? Do some analysis, do some reflective thinking. This is very important, to think reflectively. And as you do that, next I want you to identify 4 or 5 life values. What are these? As a person engaged in leadership, as I mentioned earlier, you are doing leadership. What do these values look like? What would people see if they saw you living by these values? What kind of behaviors would they see from you? It's very important. Again, that's walking the talk. That's seeing, actually, what those values are about. How would you communicate those values to your coworkers? How would you tell others that this is how you do things? Is there some accountability? You might say, well, you know, I'm not accountable for a coworker. I'm not accountable to my supervisor. My supervisor is not accountable to me. My coworkers aren't accountable to me ultimately. But there is a sense in which, well, when it comes to ethical behavior, isn't everyone accountable to each other? How are you going to communicate to that group of coworkers and others within the organization? This is how I operate. Regardless, this is what I believe is the right thing to do, and this is how I'm going to live. This is what I'm going to do. This is how I'm going to behave. How about you? How about the others? How are you going to communicate that to them? Kind of a tough situation at times, but you have to do it. This is talking about, you know, who are you as an ethical leader, especially when it comes to making ethical decisions. And so we move on to the third one, which is person. And this is pretty important. Again, this includes aspects of what we've already talked about, but it's also about who you are as what I would call a moral agent. And that is what is the capacities that you have to be ethical and moral yourself, but also to engage in this process we've been talking about, and how to make decisions that are the best possible when it comes to ethical decision making. And so we want to talk about 4 capacities that if we have these, to the extent to which we have these 4 capacities in us, we are going to do a better job of not only maintaining that sort of ethical standard for ourselves, but be able to implement and work with others in a more ethical manner, make those ethical decisions. And here are the 4 capacities: moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral character. Let's work through these. First of all, moral sensitivity. What's that mean? That was referred to something that I mentioned earlier, and that is, it's this ability to see that there's something going on. It's this ability to recognize that an ethical dilemma exists, that there's something unethical occurring. That takes a sensitivity, an ability to say, that is just not right. Where others might say, that's just, who cares? You say, no, there's something wrong going on there, not right. Let's look at number 2, moral judgment. Now that has to do with the perspective that you have. Again, how do you determine what is right and wrong? Can you make a moral judgment? You have to develop that part that we talked about, that perspective that says, here are a set of values, and those are the values that I live by. And those are the values that will inform my decision-making when it comes to dealing with an ethical dilemma. These are the values that I will embody and try to have live through me when it comes to my interactions with people and how I treat the clients and how I interact with coworkers and supervisors. These are the values that I've identified. Can you determine what is right and wrong? Can you determine what is the right thing to do? You have to have moral judgment to be able to do that. Moral motivation. Moral motivation. How motivated are you to engage in dealing with a moral situation? You know, you may recognize that something's going on. You may say, this is what's wrong here, and you may have that judgment, that capacity to say, that's wrong. But how motivated are you to do something about it? How motivated are you to change, you know, even your own behavior? If through this process that we're talking about, you realize, you know, I need to make some changes, maybe in how I operate and work with others. How motivated are you to do that? You need to think about that. You need to, are there reasons that in the work that you're doing that you feel like you're demotivated to be an ethical decision maker? If there are, you need to talk about them to somebody and say, you know what, I feel like if I do this, maybe there's going to be some repercussions to me for standing up and doing something that's right. How to deal with that. Got to identify that. If not, then how personally motivated are you to get involved? Do you really feel, you know what, can't let this go on anymore? And I'm going to try to engage. And if that even means me changing the way I look at this situation, I'm willing to do that. And then finally, moral character. And this has to do with the virtue of courage, I think. Do you have the courage to stand up and say, something's going on that's not right? It's not right because of this. You're motivated, I've got to deal with this, and now you have the courage to do it. Knowing that, you know, it may have come along with it may come some pain. Along with it may come some pushback, who knows? But do you have the courage to work through that and stand by whatever it is you need to do? You consider that. So I want you to think about today, as we come to the end of this presentation, I want you to think again, go over in your mind what we talked about. We talked about the importance of focusing on ethical behavior as it affects people. And I gave you a process, a 5-step, 6-step process that you can work through that will help you get to a point where you can make the best ethical decision that you can. But the process is not where it ends. You have to have a perspective. You have to have a set of core values that guide your ethical thinking and behavior so that you can determine what's the right thing to do as you work through the process. And I gave you some hints, some ways of how do I identify my core values? What do I do? Finally, we talked about the third P, the person. Who are you as what I call a moral agent, someone who carries with him or herself the agency of morality? Do you have that imagination to see that something exists? Do you have the capacity to make a judgment as to whether it's right and wrong? Are you motivated to stand up? And do you have the courage to deal with that in a way that's necessary in order for you to be able to carry through and make it work? So I hope you are able to benefit from the things that we talked about today. And as someone who does leadership in your organization, I hope this helps you to become a better ethical decision maker. And I thank you for your time, and goodbye.